beginning to shift from the sort of general assessment of rumination to the functional analysis session. And sometimes, depending on how well the person is doing on tracking their rumination, you will need a session between the general assessment and the first functional analysis. So in that session between, what you are doing is highlighting a few things. So, or re-highlighting some things that maybe you brought up in your introductory session. So the first is that rumination is a habit. Just really, the more that you bring to people's attention that rumination is a habit, the more effective you are at getting them to become aware and begin to notice this happening. It's also non-pathologizing, right? We all have habits. Habits develop early in our life, and we develop both good and bad habits. And so once you recognize that rumination is one of those bad habits, you can call upon other habits that you've created or stopped in your life. And this can be done in a really guided discovery way. So some of the questions that we ask in this stage are like, what do you know about habits? Do you have any good or bad habits? Have you changed any habits in the past? So this guided discovery approach helps the patient to realize like, oh, this is one of those habits, and really consolidate the concept of rumination as a habit. Okay, then point 2. So the first point was rumination is a habit. Point 2, habits can change. So this isn't some, medical condition that requires a medication to solve. This is not like, I'm not anti-medication or anything, but the point being that this mental pattern is something that's within their control, that they're empowered, just like other habits that they've changed, they're empowered to change this one as well. The third point is to build from the client's experience. So we want to understand the times when they handled problems well and the times when they did not handle problems so well. So we're beginning to form this understanding of like, oh, these are triggers and these are contexts where rumination happens. Point 4 is therapist as a coach. So unlike some other interventions in the mental health world, we're going to begin to introduce and solidify the idea that the therapist is like a coach. So many therapies will highlight that our internal voice is often not the kind coach. I don't know if any of you did sportsing when you were young. I did some sportsing, and I had some unkind coaches, right? The ones that were like screaming, keep your eye on the ball and stuff like that. And it turns out that we don't actually get better with an unkind coach. The effective coaches are the ones who build upon our existing strengths and our skills and our abilities to get us to a more effective place. So one of the things that I'll highlight in the next few weeks of our training is that idea of using the client's own words. So when we start to dig into variability, they'll say their own phrases, and I'll write down exactly, quote, in quotes, their own phrases. And then I'll highlight like, that wasn't my idea, right? That was your own amazing, beautiful brain that just came up with that phrase. It's so much more empowering than if they're borrowing from you or coming up with some mantra that's just a general good mantra. So therapist is a coach to help change the ineffective habits. All right, point 5, the importance of being aware of the triggers. So there's quotes in our hands-on guide in all of these sections that can guide you. So saying things like, the trick to changing a habit is becoming aware of the triggers to the habit and then repeatedly practicing to get to more helpful responses for the unwanted habit. So we're beginning to set a ground rule or an expectation that practice is what we're going to do. We're going to practice, 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 because the person has been practicing ruminating for most of their life up to this point. If they're like most of us humans, somewhere in 5th or 6th grade, cognitive changes, and boom, they've been practicing for a long time. Even if they're teenagers, they've been practicing for a large percentage of their life by the time they get to you. I think I blended into the next one, I'm not sure. So 0.5 is awareness of the triggers, and 6 is the importance of practice. So the sooner that you get aware of these like early warning signs, the sooner you can nip your rumination in the bud. But I'll tell you, in my own journey, what I first was able to become aware of was that my mood had tanked. Either that my mood had tanked or that I wasn't accomplishing something. So like, it would be the start of the day and I wouldn't be, diving in and doing all the things I needed to get done. Instead, I would be sitting there in a grumpy mood. And then I got better and better at going back in time and recognizing like, oh, this was the trigger to my rumination. So when I knew, for example, when I knew that I had a hard day ahead, if I started that day by listening to news, then that was a trigger that was more likely to lead to me ruminating and then lead to my mood to tank and then leading to me avoiding the things that I had to do. Now it's fine. It was fine for me to listen to news on days when I didn't have a hard day ahead, like when I had an interesting meeting like this one early in the morning, or, had something that was kind of more fun to start my day. But if it was going to be a hard day, it needed to be a day that started with a hype song. Like that's just what it has to be. So eventually, as people work through their functional analysis, they'll get to a place where they're able to understand the beginning, the early triggers and the early warning signs, but they may first get there. The access point may be through like bad mood and avoidance. So if you remember our figure from our very first lesson, that, you've got your triggers, which are external, your warning signs, which are internal. Then you have this spiral of thoughts, the rumination, that often is invisible to you, right? It's happening in the back of your mind. And then your mood is bad, you have other negative consequences. Maybe you snap at someone and you avoid the things that you need to do. So we're going to use this session after our first assessment, oftentimes just to go through their patterns. Some people, you may be able to jump right into the functional analysis. Other people, you may want to just really dig into like, okay, let's go through, we might almost consider it like a functional analysis light. Let's go through your specific rumination that you had this week, and let's just map it out. What was the trigger? What was the warning sign? What were some of the thoughts you were having? And then what were the consequences? So that's a common use of your first session after the assessment. Let's talk about functional analysis. The hands-on guide is really clear. Don't freak people out about functional analysis, right? But I find it's an important, like, informed consent. There's a fine line to walk, right? So you don't want to be like, this is going to be so hard and miserable, but you don't also want to be like, cool, we're just going to try this little thing together for the next 20 minutes. And the person's like, wait, what? So as we like go into the functional analysis, like I said, it's a much more experiential process for the client, and it's going to go into detail, some reliving of rumination. Functional analysis. What we're going to do in this session, so we're going to start by setting our agenda. And one of the things that we do in the clinical trial is right before we set the agenda, we ask 2 questions. This week, how much have you been ruminating? From 1 being low to 10 being pretty much all the time, like low, high. And this week, when you ruminated, how much control did you feel like you had over your rumination? How much did you feel like you were able to shift it or change it or bring it in your control? And this, the scale flips. So 1 is no control, 10 is high control. So I want them to begin having, the reason I like these questions is not for any actual data analysis purposes. I like these questions because they begin to plant in the client's mind that they should be kind of paying attention to how much they're ruminating over the course of their week, and that it is something that can be brought into control. And over the course of, the first 10, 12, 14 total sessions, you will start to see those numbers shift. So they might kind of escalate during a difficult week, but they'll start to gradually over time get to a better place. So I ask those questions, then I say, okay, here's our agenda for this session. I'm going to look at the homework that you did, which is your rumination log, and we're going to talk about that together. And then we're going to see if one of these instances of rumination is a good one for us to really dive into. And the reason for diving into this experience of rumination in more detail is because it's going to help me to really understand how your brain works. Then after we do that, after we really dive into that experience of rumination, I'm going to ask you how it felt, what you noticed. We're going to kind of debrief and process together. And then we're going to assign some homework for you to work on in the next week. Do you have anything to add to the agenda? Right? So making sure that the client's needs are also brought into the agenda. But I do tend to orient people to RF-CBT is structured, and I'm going to be really leading with the common agenda of homework, experiential work, new homework assigned. What's interesting is when I first learned other CBTs, I found it really awkward. And I remember sort of rebelling against the idea of an agenda and really wanting to feel like the client was empowered, and was I taking some of that away? And for me, setting an agenda has made me feel like the client is able to hold me accountable to what I said that I would do, what I would offer them in that session. And that's helped me to not drift into whatever maybe feels sort of comfortable or interesting in the session, and really hold to, what I say I'm delivering. And I think especially because also, like many therapists, I was just a little bit scared of all this experiential work when I got into it. And so the agenda is we're going to do an activity together. And that was the first thing that I would slide out of doing early on in my CBT type work, to be like, oh yeah, that experiential thing is going to be kind of complicated and awkward. So I know that's not true of some of you. Some of you are experiential masters, but I was so uncomfortable with that early on in my work. So that accountability really helps me to do that. So the functional analysis is where we get a sense of the flow of the episode of rumination for them. In order to do that, we need to make sure that they're able to really get themselves back in that moment. They have to get themselves back in that moment because remember, a lot of the rumination happens outside of awareness. And so you really do have to kind of relive the experience in order to, bring it into full awareness, I guess. So what you're going to be looking for, what I want you to write down in your notes, is that you're going to be looking for critical junctures in the flow of their rumination. So the first is when it started. The second is when it changed in emotion or content. And the third is when it stopped. And most of the time, you're going to focus on one of those 3 points, sort of when it started and leading into the rumination, when it got more intense, when it was at its worst, or when the person got out of it. And then you can do some kind of skipping ahead in the narrative, but not going in with the idea that you're going to get details about all of those critical junctures is really helpful. When you're first starting and first doing functional analysis with clients, I find it's best to do the when it was at its worst. And then once you get into the variability assessment in future sessions, where it stops or how they got out of it is the most helpful. Okay, first you have to make sure you pick a good episode of rumination. And the number one mistake that I made when I was early in my RF-CBT training is that I would pick what my supervisor would call the drama of the week. And so I was just most interested and excited to hear about the thing that happened that week. But 2 things go wrong with picking the drama of the week. The first is that it's sort of so intense for your client that they are really likely to kind of get out of scene, get out of character, and want to be like, and then she said, and then I said, right? They're going to be wanting to tell you the story instead of telling you about what their mind did with that story. So when we do the drama of the week, a lot of times the client jumps to the point in the rumination where it very first started. And when they were still in that fight with their peer, or they were still, in the middle of whatever negative thing was happening. And what you actually want is 2 hours later when they were sitting in their room and their brain kept going over and over and over it. So one of the things that we tend to do wrong is drama of the week. And then another thing that I tended to do wrong early on in the therapy is making it past tense. Like sort of a tell me what happened thing, as opposed to helping them really get immersed in the moment. So pick a rumination that is kind of habitual, not the drama of the week, and one that they can get back into. Okay, so then you're going to recreate the scene of where they were. And we really do need to start this about 10 minutes into your session. So getting your orientation, your grounding, checking in, and then starting on figuring out which episode of rumination you're going to pick. Like you're gonna want to look at their sheet and try and figure out which one looks the most habitual, which one do they have a good memory of. And by 10 minutes in, you want to be like really recreating the scene. Otherwise, you'll run out of time. In recreating the scene, I will do this very much like a mindfulness activity. I'll say, okay, I want you to kind of settle in, get comfortable. We're not going to start the whole thing right away, but I want to just really be able to visualize where you are. So I'll go through all 5 of the senses. What do you see around you? And, make sure to ask really detailed questions about what they see, right? So, what colors are you noticing? What's the lighting like? That gives you a sense of like, was it dusk or nighttime? Was there a bright lamp? What textures do you notice? Where are you right in this moment? Okay, you're on your bed. What do you see on your bed? What's around you on the floor? What do you notice on the walls, right? You're just really trying to get them back in that moment. And then, are you noticing any smells or tastes? Any sounds? What are you feeling with your body? Are you in contact with the bed? Are you laying down? Are you sitting up? Are you leaning against your wall? So some people are really good at this. You'll just ask one question and they'll come in with like a whole full-on narrative. And some people will need you to just keep asking the questions. There are some quotes in the hands-on guide. So after I get them sort of immersed, I'll give them a brief orientation before taking them back into that scene. So I'll say, when you describe, and this is in your guide, when you describe this recent example of rumination, I would like you to imagine it as if you were there right now, describing what you can see and hear and feel, exactly what you're doing, as if you are back in the scene, in your own body, looking through your own eyes. It can also be helpful to try and slow things down as if you were running a film in slow motion, second by second, frame by frame. As best as you can, please recall and visualize the scene as vividly and in as much detail as possible. And then I'll say, if you're ready, let's close your eyes and imagine yourself back in that scene as if you're there right now. So I'll ask them to close their eyes or soften their gaze. Some people are more comfortable with just sort of softening their gaze. If they are at home, it's a really good time to make sure that there are pets in the room. Pets, for whatever reason, seem to find functional analysis very interesting. I don't know if it's the soothing voice of the therapist, but they'll just be like, what are you doing? And like come up and like jump on the computer or whatever else. So that can disrupt things. So reliving the moment instead of retelling it. Okay, so you want to be there with them, right? You want it described well enough that you are there with them in the moment. And you have a good sense of the circumstances and location and their full sensory perceptual experience. These are again in your hands-on guide, to get them into the scene. Things like, where were you when this happened? I already said, what did you see here? What are you looking at? What are you doing? But a couple of other things that can be nice is to start to begin some of the questions that will appear in the functional analysis. What are you saying to yourself? And what are you paying attention to? Okay. Now we go into the functional analysis. And the way that RF-CBT describes our questions as being contextually bound. So what that means is that you're going to kind of take the last thing that they said and use it to build the next question. So, as you are having the thought, I'm never good enough in this class, what emotion are you noticing coming up? Right? So you're like kind of building the context of the last thing they said, helps build the next question. So now we're going to start going into the functional analysis together. So I'll say something like, you're in your room and you're noticing the light coming in through the blinds. It's 4 o'clock. You're tired after a long day of school. You can hear your mom downstairs talking with your brother. You can feel the texture of your bed. When you look over to your left, you see your homework piled up on your desk. What is the first thought you notice? And you'll notice I'm doing this in a very slow, very calming tone. And if the client starts to pick up the pace, you're going to slow them down. So you'll notice I said, what is the first thought that you notice, right? Trying to get at just one single thought. So if the client says, I can't believe that the math teacher assigned us more homework, I'm like thinking about all the things that the math teacher has assigned, like they start giving you multiple thoughts, you'll say, okay, let's slow that down. So the first thought you notice is, I can't believe the math teacher assigned more homework. When you have that thought, what do you feel in your body? I'm tense. My hands are sweaty. My fists are clenched. Let's slow that down. So you're feeling tense in your body. After you notice that, what do you do next? I look over at my homework and I think, I'm never going to get this done. Okay, so you looked over your homework and then you notice the thought, right? So you're going to help by labeling also. You notice the thought, I'm never going to get this homework done. And when you had that thought, what did you feel? What emotion are you feeling? And you notice I'm correcting myself because it's so easy to slip into past tense. And I just correct myself when it happens in the moment. What are you feeling, right? I'm feeling angry. And when you notice that anger, where do you feel that in your body? And then what happens next? So when you get kind of stuck, I tell you, I have questions like when I'm doing this therapy, I'll put questions up around me. I'll have the questions in front of me if I'm in the room, because it's really easy to get in that moment and be like, I have no idea what question to ask next. Panic in the therapist's mind. And so having them right in front of you can be super duper helpful. This is kind of a thing that helped me, but a long, long time ago, there was this movie called Dude, Where's My Car? Some of you may have seen it. And there's this scene where they go to order Chinese food at the restaurant or in like a drive-through restaurant. And they're at the drive-through ordering. And they say, we'd like this thing. And the person taking the order says, and then they add more things. And then the person says, and then. And the person just keeps saying, and then they keep adding more things to the order. And eventually they're like, no more and then they're like fighting with the person. So it's a little ridiculous. But if you run out of ideas of what question to ask next, you can fall back on, and then, right? Just what's going on next?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you have run into situations with clients who tend to not have a strong experience of their inner world, or just tend to have more positive speech and say things like, I don't know if that's it. I don't remember anything else, or and how do you work with that? I get a lot of anxiety comes up with me when clients behave in that way, and I know I'm about to do something that's more experiential. So I'm wondering, if you have any words of advice there.
Yeah, that is really great. So one of the things I say in orientation that I forgot to say here with all of us is I'll say, the important thing is not that you have to remember exactly how it was. I want you to relive it just like you're there in the moment. And what that means is that if whatever you think you would have felt or said or thought, it doesn't have to be exactly accurate to what happened, right? Just get into the moment right now with me and like do your best with what you think and feel right now as I put you in that scene. So that helps because it's sort of, if the client says, I can't remember, then you can say, just go with the flow of what it feels like right now. You've just had the thought, I'm never good enough for this teacher. What emotion comes up, right? So like, I'll just sort of bring them back. If they open their eyes and come out of the experiential, then I'll usually say like, let's just do a little bit more. Let's go ahead and fast forward to the part where it got its worst, right? So like, I'll try and pull them back in. For some clients, they will just sort of be like, I can't really do this. And then I'll go into a more traditional functional analysis of like, okay, let's just talk about it and we'll try again another day because I know it can be really helpful to get into it. But like, it may be that we just need to understand, the story a little better in this case, or maybe we picked a scenario that like wasn't super fresh for you or that you can't remember all the details. So I do tend to just like, whatever they're throwing at me, I'm like, okay, we're rolling with this now. now we're over here doing this other thing. And there have been some clients that it's taken like 3 tries or so to get something close to a complete, and by complete, I don't mean the full timeline. I mean complete in the sense that I've seen at least a couple of their patterns in the functional analysis. And then I'll kind of move on. If by the time you get to a 4th try at functional analysis, it's probably too much for that client. And so then I'm going to try and get into the functional analysis of variability, which tends to feel better for people because they're talking about a time that they did better.
Yeah, I was curious about that, Sheila. In prolonged exposure, we're monitoring SUDS throughout the experiential and doing things to raise the SUDS if they're too low, lower them if they're too high, to help them stay in kind of a therapeutic window. And so I was curious about that, if there are ever times where you might encourage the person, okay, talk about it in the present, but go ahead and open your eyes. As an example of how we would turn the SUDS down in PE. And also just observing one thing that I have done in other therapies is let people know that there's we're going to spend about, 25 minutes on this. And if we run out of content, we're just going to start back at the beginning again. And so that sometimes incents people to stay, they're not going to just say, I don't remember and get out of the assessment or the discussion or the exposure. So it's just curious for your thoughts on those and how they might fit or not.
Yeah. So we don't formally monitor SUDS in the functional analysis. I have said things like, we're going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes on this, and we'll do that even if you get stuck. We'll just go to the next place that you can, recall and relive. So I will say the soothing nature of the voice, this is almost like a mindfulness, does tend to help people keep their SUDS low. And then the other thing that tends to keep, or not low, but like their SUDS in a more manageable zone, is that you're trying to isolate each thought and feeling and physical sensation and behavior in just one. And that bite-sized frame by frame approach tends to keep things a little more in that zone of that therapeutic zone, as you called it. When I get stuck, in addition to the and then question, I will just think about your basic CBT model, right? So the basic CBT model is thoughts, emotions, physiology, and behavior are all influencing one another. And so I'll try to just go with those 4 as my core. But in addition to those 4, I'll ask questions like, what are you noticing? Which is a behavior, but highlighting the behavior of where their gaze is. What sensations are you feeling in your body? After that thought went through your mind, what next thought happened in the next second? Where are you focusing your attention right now? So these questions, just help bring it back. There's a couple more here that I want to highlight. So what movement are you making? What is your tone of voice? So a lot of times people will be ruminating as they're in an interaction with someone. And then, I'll ask the question, like, what are you doing next? I told my partner that hike was too long. And then what is your tone of voice as you're saying that hike was too long to your partner? And then you can fast forward to the end. If you want, you can be like, okay, let's skip ahead to the point at which you stopped ruminating. What are you doing now? I turned off my light and I put my covers on. Like, okay, cool. You can open your eyes. And then we do the summary and review. You might want to extend your session if you haven't timed this right, because you don't really want to leave the person with like, okay, cool, good functional analysis, keep tracking your rumination. You really want a chance to say, what did you notice? What did you learn? This is where I sometimes get people who are like, I didn't learn anything. And that my move when that comes up is to be like, well, I learned a lot, right? To just be like, it was really helpful for me to see the way things happen in your mind and your body. Like, I noticed this thought, I always mess up my relationships. That's a big deal thought, right? So I'll like pull them to a place that was particularly relevant or interesting. But many clients will have like oh, I did not realize what I was doing experience from this. And it will be one of the more powerful turning points of the intervention. So they might say that they're tired or they're upset, or they might be crying. And, but they will also say things like, it was really helpful. I had no idea I talked to myself like that. I would never say something like that to someone else. And then for you to just kind of flow it back through, right? So I notice, that this trigger of your partner coming home late when you've, got dinner ready and it's already starting to get cold is like a big trigger for your rumination. And that you have thoughts like, our relationship is never going to work. And I've told that asshole 10 times, so I'll sort of summarize what the thing is, what the pattern is, and what happened in their body. And then our assignment, if we feel like we didn't get enough juice in the functional analysis, I'll assign again, track rumination. If I feel like I really got like a good functional analysis, and especially if I'm like, have a limited number of sessions with the person, then I will have them track the variability. And that's what I'm going to ask you all to do this week, just so that we have a few weeks of variability tracking, which is you've been tracking your rumination for a few weeks. So hopefully, your common triggers. I want you to do the same thing, notice your triggers, but when you did something different, whatever it is, right? You had the thought, some effective thought, like, I'm stronger than this situation, or whatever your effective thought is that comes up that week. Or maybe you did something like, you're like, screw this, I'm going to quit work and I'm going to go ski. And you just like changed your behavior and you did something that was effective. So we're going to see what the variability is.